I have come around to believing that attachment trauma underlies a whole lot of other forms of childhood trauma. And so I find it really frustrating and confusing how people who exclusively have emotional neglect trauma tend to feel like their trauma is really not valid. Although I can easily understand why they struggle to validate that, because most of society teaches us that there are certain things that are traumatic, like sexual abuse or being severely physically beaten, or not having enough food to eat or things like that. And emotional neglect of children just really doesn't make the list of examples of trauma that we typically hear. And yet, I've read books that talk about how the big difference between what makes some kids experience essentially a traumatic event, or a adverse childhood experience, I think is kind of the technical term for that. But what kids experience that event and end up traumatized from it, and which ones experience it and are able to move through it without having PTSD type symptoms, not actually ending up traumatized despite experiencing that same event, is the degree of support and community. And I believe that's true for adults as well. It's not just children, but of course, children are in a uniquely vulnerable position in a lot of ways, in that they can't create their own community. They're largely just stuck in whatever family they were born into. Sometimes people will feel like, well, my mom or both of my parents are good people. They're loving people. I can tell that they tried and that they cared about me. So why do I still feel traumatized and like I was emotionally neglected? And I think digging into what causes insecure attachment can be really helpful for that, because insecure attachment doesn't have to mean that you had a parent who was cold or that didn't care. And there's a part of this book I want to read to kind of validate that. Holding mother responsible for our insecure attachment is not saying that she is somehow bad or even uncaring. There are many things that may be going on. For one, she may love her baby but feel frightened or repulsed by being needed. So this is just me talking, but what my mind went for this, and it's not even my situation, is I feel like there's a large generation of women that were really preached to about being hyper independent. And I have to think that if you were raised being preached to about how important it is to not rely on others, and being taught to be hyper independent, how that might then make you have a really difficult relationship with other people who are kind of quote unquote needy or dependent, including babies or elderly people or sick people. Anybody who can't be independent, you might see that as weakness and off putting. And it just makes me really sad to think that there was, I think I tend to associate it with Gen X, but that there was a lot of people who were set up to really, really prioritize hyper independence, and how that probably then turned around and made it difficult for them to have their babies be needy. Unfortunately, this leads to a vicious cycle, because the more that the mother withdraws and withholds her care, the more the baby will signal its need. And it is the signaling of this need and the urgency behind it that will frighten the mother. So the baby cries, the mom is put off by the baby being needy and doesn't respond to the baby's needs effectively. The baby gets more upset, cries more urgently or more frantically. The mother finds that even more off-putting. And so this dance between the baby's needs increasing and the mother being more put off and eventually even frightened is this tornado that cycles together. Other contributors can include being unskilled at reading a baby's signals, being preoccupied, being overwhelmed, being depressed, being insecure, or overly sensitive to rejection, or having been unmothered herself. If her mother was not able to graciously give to her or attune to her needs, if her mother was too cold or too busy, then this pattern is branded into her, which she will unwittingly repeat. Often people find it elicits a deep hurt and is hard to tolerate when others receive what was so painfully missing for them, and mothers are subject to this too.